بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على مبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم ألهمنا رشدنا وفقنا بما تحب وترضى. أما بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So we've reached verse 5 from Surah Yunus, reciting with أعوذ بالله الشيطان الرجيم هو الذي جعل الشمس ضياء والقمر نورا وقدره منازل لتعلموا عدد السنين والحساب ما خلق الله ذلك إلا بالحق يفصل الآيات لقوم يعلمون. So far, as you can understand, there's very much a circular thought from the chapter, and this is an example of the entire Quran. That is, the entire Quran stems from the argumentation and position that indeed there is a God, and that this God is one, is unique. And in this enlightenment, there is a purpose in life. Choices that you make have weight and accountability, and sooner or later, you'll return back to that initial meeting with the Almighty. With that, the Quran moves forward in circles, moves forward in circles, moves forward in circles. And you can see that in this chapter, which is, I believe, a good example if we were to stop and think of the entire Quran, because the entire Quran should be recited in theory as if it is one chapter. Now, what I mean by that, I mean to say things support one another. So if it is circular, that means information from here also goes back there, and information from there also goes forward there. Okay, so there is a circular motion. And this is known as thinking in circles. And we had briefly talked about this, that this is essentially one of the unique mechanisms of the Arabic Hebrew languages. And that it isn't necessarily linear, though it does entail portions of linearism, which is like introduction, body, and conclusion. And we do find that in the chapter of the Quran known as the chapter of Yosof, which is Joseph. But the majority of the Quran, one might hold the position that it is circular. Okay? And when you come through from the beginning of the chapter to the end, it returns back in a circle. With that, in this chapter, Surah Yunus, you do find that as well. If you remember, our first verses essentially was a proposition that discussing the position of what the Quran entails. It also talked about that this position of what the Quran entails essentially is a voice of the Almighty, and that this Almighty is one God, and these are the proofs of it. And one of those proofs is the concept of contingency. And contingency means something comes into existence and it is unique, but its existence by itself means that there was something before it. Okay, this is known as contingency. So you look to the planetation and the plants out there, and you see that the plants exist, but how did it come? What came before? Why is this plant here? Where's the mother of that plant, and that mother of that mother, and that mother of that mother, and what supported its growth, etc. So something existing due to the reliance upon something else, and at the same time, by this thing existing, we know for a fact that, for example, my parents had existed because I'm here. So this is known as contingency. So in our prior verses, there were specifics revolving around that, generalizations that in the creation of the heavens and the earth, etc. And at the same time, we understand in that proposition there is an independency. So the contingency means it relies upon something else, or it came from something else. But eventually, there's going to be some type of end if we move back to some level of unlimited billions to the power of the billion, whatever it may be. And that initial existence of that first primal essence, for Muslims, they argue that it is the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that this initial existence had to have always existed. And without that, you see, if there was no initial existence, then the contingency continues to go back. And it comes from something, it comes from something, it comes from something. But essentially, the argument still ends at something. And what is that thing? For Muslims, they hold the position that this is the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that in this contingency that the Almighty has, design laws for us to ponder over and think of. Moving on here, this verse 5, reinforces that. And one of its specifications is interesting, something we can relate to directly. هو الذي جعل الشمس ضياء. And huwa, which means he, but essentially it is the majestic he, referring back to the Almighty. And the Almighty, Allah, is not male gendered. It uses connotations to represent strength. Now, with that in mind, هو الذي جعل الشمس ضياء, that the Almighty is the one who orchestrated ash-shams ضياء. And this is interesting because the sun is described in this Quranic verse as a ضياء. And ضياء means yudwi. It provides light. Okay? It is light and it shoots out light. And as a result, things become brightened from it. وَالْقَمَرَ نُورًا. And then it goes on to say, and in addition to that, from the هُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلَ الشَّمْسَ ضِيَاءً, the Almighty is the one who made the sun, this brightening substance, as you can see, and it causes brightness in other things. It goes on to say, and in addition to this brightness that it brightens, وَالْقَمَرَ نُورًا, the moon, if you look to the construction of the language, you can entail that the moon as well is being brightened by the sun. So this is one of the interesting things that Islamic scientists have discussed earlier on, that the moon is described as having nura, which is the next portion of the verse here, وَالْقَمَرَ نُورًا. And prior to that is the concept of liya. Liya is causing light, and as such, there are things being reflected by light. In addition to that specification, there is the moon. The moon is discussed, and the moon is given a detail which is nuran. And nuran essentially means that it is having a form of reflective light. Diya comes first and then nuran. And this is one of the unique things of the Quranic phrase. That's why we say, for example, wujuhu nuran. People say that at times. They say that person's face is filled with nur. And nur, it does mean light, a form of dimmed light, a form of light. It also means, with specification, a form of bliss, bliss from the Almighty. So as a result, from a person's spiritual state, righteous actions, and sincerity to the Almighty, the reflection of this goodness of righteousness then stems to the outward limbs at times. And as a result, a person's face at times is blissful, right? It is being reflective of that righteousness and spirituality they are putting forth. And as such, it is being brightened by that. وَقَدَّرَهُ مَنَازِلٍ. And it goes on to say, the Quranic verse goes on to talk about the uniqueness of things, and these things are contingencies, because the beginning of the verse it says huwa, and that's the independency, and then there are contingencies. The independent is the one who designed and facilitated the universe, and in that universe is the element of a shams, which is this unique star, the sun, and it is a form of gastral frame that causes this brightening and reflective light upon people and things. And then wal qamar, and then the moon in specification is receiving this reflective light of this diya, and it is producing a nur, like a dimmed form of light. وَقَدَّرَهُ. And then it goes on to say, in addition to this, قَدَّرَهُ. And قَدَّرَهُ is interesting because it essentially means that like the Almighty had prepared and gave the ability and specification and account to the moon here. Okay, so the verse is talking about the sun, the moon, and in the qualities of the moon, قَدَّرَهُ مَنَازِلٍ. قَدَّرَهُ مَنَازِلٍ. In the qualities of the moon, there is positioning. Manazil is like a form of positioning and rest. Okay, and that moon is known as manazil لِتَعْلَمُ عَدَدَ السِّنِينَ وَالْحِسَابِ. The moon is utilized so that one of its forms of benefits is so you are able to calculate, okay, and count as-sinin, the years, wal-hisab. Okay, you are able to count the years, and there is hisab, and hisab is interesting, which does consist of a form of mathematical observation. In this regard, it essentially provides for you a calendar, and this form of calendar and mathematical observation helps address seasons of the year, times of the year, seasons of the year. And had it not been for this differentiation between the night and the day and their essential clauses that are come to known as the sun and the moon, then it would just be day, for example. And if day were to just continue, it become difficult to be able to rely upon a seasonal observation of days and the changing of days and the changing of times and circumstances. And this is one of the things that we understand is of the contingencies. So if the sun was a little bit closer, we know the earth would burn up; a little bit farther, it would freeze. Same thing for the moon. There would be an issue with gravity, among other things, and it's placed in the exact place for which it just so happens that its position and its size gives enough leverage to create a lunar eclipse, for example. Okay, and when that happens, we understand that in its position, then the solar eclipse, then what happens is the sun dims because there is a covering of exact size and measurement and placement that allows for the people on Earth, depending on its size and its position, to look and have the sun be temporarily covered, per se. And this all goes on to say, مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ ذَلِكَ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. This is all from the design of the Almighty. In truth, there are laws that govern things that are around you. يُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْلَمُونَ. The Almighty puts forth signs, verses, for a people and demonstrates these verses and signs in detail so that people have an opportunity to come to knowledge. And لِقَوْمٍ يَعْلَمُونَ, for a people of knowledge. This consists of two forms, like everyday transactions. The verses talking about the moon and the sun and the seasons and these type of things. At the same time, to understand the concept of contingency. And that this perfection, we would argue, like a person leaving a forest into a garden that is cut and designed perfectly, to rationalize that indeed there was a farmer here. وَلَهُ الْمَثْلُ الْأَعْلَى فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. The Almighty is much more unique than the observation of a farmer, etc. But this is an analogy for us to stop and think that, hey, the universe is very much a garden in the midst of a forest. The Almighty knows best. Subhanallah bihamdihi, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.